The Massachusetts Air National Guardsman accused of leaking highly classified military documents is expected to change his plea to guilty on Monday.
And Western Mass News reporter Taylor Smith has more details on what he's currently facing. Good morning, Taylor.
Good morning, David and Amanda. And according to a new court filing and sources familiar with the case, Jack Teixeira has struck a deal with federal prosecutors to change his plea to guilty for 6 counts of willful retention and transmission of national defense information. On Thursday, federal prosecutors in Boston filed a motion for a Rule 11 hearing on Monday, where Teixeira is expected to change his plea to guilty, although it will still be up to the judge to determine whether his potential prison time. Teixeira, who was 21 years old when he was arrested back in June of 2023, is accused of abusing his security clearance and posting classified documents on social media sites back in 2022. The Airman allegedly revealed all kinds of military equipment the United States was preparing to give to Ukraine, how the equipment would be transferred, and how the equipment would be used. It's not quite clear what charges he plans to plead guilty to or what potential deal he struck with the prosecutors, but he faces spending decades in prison if convicted. Teixeira worked in cyber systems for an intelligence wing of the Air National Guard. Allegedly, his superiors repeatedly warned him not to access or take notes of classified intelligence unrelated to his role before his April arrest. And in December of last year, 15 airmen were also disciplined, including with the removal of their command for failing to take proper action when they found out about Teixeira's intelligence leaking activities. And in the next half hour, I'll have more details on his intelligent leaking activities leading up to his April arrest. And I'm live in the studio this morning. Taylor Smith, Western Mass News.